Welcome to this tutorial for the Headwind A330 for MSFS. This tutorial is from a runway start with engines on. A cold and dark start tutorial will follow at a later date. We've planned our flight in the MSFS world map. A tutorial on how to do this is linked in the description below. I recommend you watch this tutorial before flying the plane. Pause at every milestone and take notes. Then when you do fly, use your notes to guide you. With that said, let's jump inside and go fly. Before your first flight, you'll need to calibrate your throttle detents for this aircraft. The settings can be found in Settings, Sim Options and Calibrate. If you're using a regular throttle, you'll just see one axis here. If you're using the Thrustmaster Airbus throttle, you'll want to click Independent Axis. This will allow you to configure your throttle easily. To configure your throttle detents, click each detent, move your throttle to the desired position for that detent, then click Set from Throttle. Once you've configured all your throttle detents, you'll want to click Apply, then Save and Apply to commit your settings. You'll also need to configure your fuel load in the FlyPad EFB. This can be found in the Dispatch menu and then the Fuel subcategory. Simply use the slider in the Refuel box to select your desired amount of fuel and hit Load. It's now time to configure the FMC and Autopilot, so first things first, hit B to set your altimeter to the correct local pressure. On the FMC, you want to enter the FMGC menu, then hit Flight Plan. The Headwind A330 now uses custom fly-by-wire LNAV logic. This means it doesn't always play nicely with the world map flight planner. So if you see any duplicate waypoints or discontinuities in your flight plan, just clear them out as I've done here. We'll now click through to the initialization page. We'll enter a cost index of 100 and a cruising altitude of 26,000 feet for this short flight. On the next page, click the soft key next to zero fuel weight twice, and we can now move on to the perf page. Transition altitude in the UK is 5,000. We'll set flaps 1 for takeoff with a neutral takeoff trim, and a flex temperature of 40 is a good default. Double click the soft keys next to your V-speeds and they'll be loaded into the FMC. With that complete, we'll set the FMC back to the flight plan page and head up to the autopilot panel. You'll see most things are in managed mode now. We'll dial in our cruising altitude of 26,000 feet and we're almost ready to go. Your takeoff checklist should be complete by default, but if it isn't, just clear that out before you begin your takeoff roll. Ready in the cabin is achieved by double clicking the forward cabin call button on the overhead panel, and the buttons to test takeoff config can be found on the pedestal just below the ECAM. We'll release the parking brake and bring throttles up to the flex detent. When we reach our takeoff speed, gently pull the nose back and follow the flight director. Raise the gear when you have a positive rate of climb, and you can enable the autopilot at about 400 feet.
Is passing 1,800 feet, climbing 9,000 feet.
During climb out, the PFD will request that you move the throttles to the climb detent. You'll see Leave a Climb appear on the PFD, and move the throttles to the climb detent when you see that. When everything is properly configured, the plane should stay in managed speed mode, but the Headwind A330 sometimes defaults to a selected speed mode when you move your throttles to climb. If this happens, just increase the selected airspeed on the autopilot panel to 250 knots below 10,000 feet. At some points during your climb, the plane may level off to obey altitude constraints that exist in your flight plan. You'll see altitude constraint displayed on the PFD when this happens, and after the plane has passed the constraint, it will continue its climb. You'll see here that we're just about to pass transition altitude, which is 5,000 feet in the UK. As soon as we reach that altitude, we'll want to set our altimeter to standard. We do this by pulling out the barometric pressure button to set standard pressure. And shown here is the plane continuing its climb after clearing an altitude constraint. If you're in selected speed mode, when you pass 10,000 feet, you'll want to increase your selected airspeed to about 320 knots. This may vary depending on aircraft load, so pay attention to the overspeed tape displayed on the PFD. At cruising altitude, the plane will level off. You will see altitude displayed on the PFD, followed by altitude cruise. It's now time to start configuring some stuff for our descent, so we'll go to the Performance menu on the EFB and the Landing tab. We'll enter our destination airport in the search box and click Get Meta. The weather data for our destination will load, and we can use this to populate the approach page of the FMC. On this page, we can start by entering the winds for our destination. So at Glasgow, these are from 250 degrees and are at about 19 knots. Transition altitude at Glasgow is 5,000 feet. Bear in mind that transition altitude varies between countries. For example, in the US it's 18,000. We'll continue to populate this page. Temperature at Glasgow 15 degrees and QNH of 1012. We're going to have minimums of 150 feet above ground level. In the flight plan page, we'll want to find our bottom of descent altitude. This is generally the altitude at the intercept waypoint for the localizer. At Glasgow it's 2,900 feet, so this is what we'll dial in on the MCP ready for our descent. We can find our top of descent under the top of descent tab in the performance category on the EFB. We'll synchronize our current altitude and enter our desired target altitude, which is 2,900. This gives us a top of descent of 73 nautical miles before our intercept waypoint. Our intercept waypoint is 15 miles before the airport itself. If we need to descend 73 miles before our intercept waypoint, and our intercept waypoint is 15 miles before the airport, we therefore need to start our descent at 88 miles before the airport. Distance to the airport is displayed at the bottom of the flight plan page. Some more housekeeping to take care of while we're at cruise. Set the auto brake to medium for approach. And what you'll likely find is that after entering your approach data in the FMC, you can once again place the aircraft in managed speed mode. In the nav radio page of the FMC, you'll see that our destination ILS frequency has automatically been tuned. As we pass 88 miles to the airport, which is our top of descent, we can now head up to the autopilot panel and initiate our descent by clicking Enable Managed Altitude Mode. The plane will now idle the throttle and begin its managed descent. When the plane reaches 10,000 feet, it will decelerate to 250 knots. And as you pass through transition altitude, 5,000 feet in the UK, push the barometric pressure button and hit B to set local pressure. If your flight plan does not contain a deceleration waypoint, on your perf menu you want to go to the descent page, hit activate approach phase and confirm approach phase. The plane will now start to decelerate to its approach speed. You'll want to do this around the time you're turning to head towards your intercept waypoint. Regardless of whether you initiated the approach mode or whether the plane started to decelerate on its own, you want to increment the flaps as the plane gets slower. By the time the plane has finished decelerating to approach speed, you want to be configured with full flaps and landing gear down. When the landing checklist appears, most items should be complete. You may have to check the cabin is ready. Just double click the forward cabin call button on the overhead panel to tick this item off. At bottom of descent, the plane will enter altitude mode and you can switch on the approach mode. The plane will continue to follow its flight plan until it intercepts the localizer. You can see localizer and glide slope modes are now armed. If you press the LS button above the PFD, the ILS data will be displayed on the PFD. When the plane intercepts the localizer annunciator will appear at the top of the PFD and the plane will turn to face the runway. When the aircraft intercepts the glide slope and starts to descend, you'll see the glide slope annunciator on the PFD. For an automatic landing, you can engage Autopilot 2 as soon as you're on the glide slope. At 400 feet, with automatic landing armed, a land annunciator will appear on the PFD. If you're landing manually, this is usually a good time to deactivate the autopilot by hitting the autopilot disengaged hotkey or the AP1 button.
100.
At 50 feet, in automatic landing mode, you'll see the flare annunciator.
50, 40, 30, 20, 10, retard.
Throttles to idle and activate reversers on touchdown. Reversers off, throttles to idle at around 80 knots and auto brake will bring you to a stop. You can click the auto brake button to disengage auto brake, then just increase your throttle to begin your taxi off the runway. This concludes our tutorial flight in the Headwind A330. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you found it useful. If you did, please drop a like and feel free to subscribe, as I make this kind of content fairly regularly. Take care, and I'll see you next time.